He's one of the most well-known personalities on the internet for web design, more so because he's been around for ages.
Not that long. Jesus, why do I turn up to these things?
He created his first website in 1997 and has now a wealth of knowledge in both the industry and the sector. So, Andy, welcome on the stage.
Cheers, mate. How you doing? I just want to say a huge thank you to all the Codeworks people and the organisers for putting on such a great show. And most importantly, I feel, for proving that Brighton is not the centre of the known universe, as one might be led to believe. So, I want to talk about this thing that I've had a bee in my bonnet about for a little while, which I call hard-boiled web design. And when I started talking about this, quite a few people would say, what on earth is this kind of hard-boiled thing that Malarkey's rattling on about? So I want to start off by reading you a little something which is very dear to my heart. So, I looked at him and laughed. He turned his head and stared right into the muzzle of his own gun. The killer's face was a vile mask of hatred. He had his mouth open, screaming, with all the furies of the gods dethroned. But my laugh was even louder. He was still screaming when I pulled the trigger. Now, despite what Dan Rubin might say, that was not part of the minutes from one of my client meetings. Or, in fact, some of the minutes from a CSS working group meeting. It's from My Gun is Quick by one of my favourite hard-boiled detective authors, Mickey Spillane. So what the hell is hard-boiled, is the question that gets asked. Who here's read any kind of hard-boiled detective fiction over the years? Mickey Spillane, Dashiell Hammett, all of those kind of people. If you've not really read too much in terms of crime fiction, then you might be familiar with Humphrey Bogart in The Maltese Falcon, which is the second best detective story, best detective movie ever. Second only, of course, to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Or, if you're old enough, you might remember this guy. Stacey Keach's Mike Hammer in that really terrible kind of 80s TV series. And then, of course, there's this guy. This was from a college project of mine in, when was it? 1986. So, where did that guy go? Now, if you read anything, if you know anything about hardboiled detective fiction, you'll soon learn that it's all centred around the hero of these stories. And heroes like Mickey Spillane, they work outside of the law, they work outside of society's conventions in this attempt to do the right thing and to achieve natural justice. And because they work outside of the law, they can do things that conventional society says that we as citizens can't normally do. They're still fighting on the side of right, but they're able to do things that convention tells us that we can't do. But they know to strive for what is possible. And that's something which I think we can learn a huge amount from when it comes to web design. Because, you know, we're in a young and dynamic industry, and I think that doing stuff outside of convention, breaking rules or making rules rather than following rules, is really what we should be doing to make exciting stuff for the web. Exciting stuff like this. Come on, just admit it. This was the reason why you got into web design, wasn't it? This is the reason why I started learning CSS. Eric Meyer's work is done. So you'd think that, in general, people would be really excited and passionate and enthusiastic about making amazing things for the web. And there's a lot of cool stuff that we can do, and there's a lot of creative opportunities that we can have. And you'd think that we'd be really excited. But when you read articles or tutorials published on the web, this is from Smashing Magazine, which is one of my favourites, softer and more absorbent than most magazines. This is a quote here. I can't wait to start using the new CSS3 standard. We'll come back to that in a minute. But I don't think we can start just yet. I should be reading this in a Polish accent, really. Especially when IE isn't supported in some of these. Or there's another one here. I hope CSS3 will be a standard, God forbid, in the near future. Right now, you can't really use anything of it because not every browser supports it. You've seen these kind of things. Yali wrote a fantastic article on Smashing Magazine when these were the comments. I'm glad you're actually in the room. So you would think that we would be heroic and really wanting to make the most of all of these creative opportunities that these wonderful new technologies can give us. But most of the time, we're not heroes at all. Most of the time, we just whine about what we can't do rather than what we can do. And, you know, if you're working on a project, you might just try and sneak in, maybe, the occasional bit of rounded corners into things. And if you're really working for a client that allows you to push the boat out, you might sort of tuck a little drop shadow in there as well. I mean, fucking hell. Now, I don't blame people for thinking this way a lot of the time. Because it's one of the reasons why I think we think in this way, or have thought in this way, is because the way that we have both misunderstood and interpreted this term progressive enhancement. I'm sure we've all heard of this, yeah? Where we start off with base level markup, we start off with meaningful and accessible HTML, we'll build on the top of that with CSS for styling and JavaScript for behavior. I called it a web standards trifle once. And this is the way in which we've been thinking about web design and thinking about how we can potentially use all of this exciting new CSS stuff that we have. But the problem is that progressive enhancement shouldn't be applied to actual visual design. It shouldn't be applied to the stuff that we're doing. This is the first instance, really. This is a quote from Dave Shea. He's that guy that made the CSS Zen Garden all those years ago. And the key sentence in this quote is, after creating a basic functioning page, is what he was talking about. Functioning page in terms of something working, not necessarily how something looks. This is the famous article. This comes from Steve Champion. He's that other guy that made the Web Standards Project. And the key line in here, which I'm sure you've all read this article at some point, is building for the least capable devices, devices being the optimum word there, first. At no point were these people talking necessarily about visual design. They were talking about ensuring that everything was going to be accessible when we stripped away one of those layers. It was never necessarily about the actual visual design or look and feel of a website or application. Now, this term was actually coined in 2003. That's 7 years ago, which is a long time in dog years. Coincidentally, the same year that George Bush declared mission accomplished in Iraq. That goes down like a pork chop at a bar mitzvah when I give this talk in America. Now, in 2003, this is what you'd have in your pocket. And if you're pretty daring, you'd go for the 30 gig maximum version. If you were building for the web, designing for the web, this is the stuff that you had on your PC or Mac. 7 years ago, and yet we're still bound by this convention. We're still thinking that we should be bound by this interpretation of progressive enhancement. Now, you know, we can dress it up any way that we want. Dan Cederholm started calling it progressive enrichment quite recently in a lot of his really good books, where he actually says about layering on visual treats for people that use modern software. You've heard that kind of approach? But actually, if we want to be creating some of the really inspiring and dynamic work that I know that we can do for the web, we need to think about things differently. And we need to take a much, much broader view as to what it is that we're actually designing for. Because quite often we get hung up on this idea about browsers. We get hung up on this, well, I can't do this because of this particular audience group, or we can't do this because of this. But actually, when you look at the broad spread now, these are just desktop browsers. We're not going to talk today about the massive array of different mobile devices out there. This is some of the CSS stuff, because CSS is very close to my heart, that we can use now reliably across an enormous variety of progressive browsers. So things, from basic border radius to border images, using images inside those border regions, to CSS columns or even gradients. We can do some other things where we can use keyframe animations for subtle effects, or really usefully multiple background images. Do you spot a pattern in all of this, by the way? Unfortunately, that may change. It certainly looks like it's going to be changing. I've been wanting to do that on a slide for years. And IE9 had a meeting with Microsoft a couple of weeks ago. They really are very, very keen on getting as much advice from us as a community in terms of what we think their priority should be to move ahead. So in terms of things that will be in IE9, you can see that the level playing field is becoming much, much more established there, including lots of new color models, opacity, again, multiple background images, lots of the stuff that we've really wanted to use. But, we need to think about the way that we design things differently. Because so often we've been told or thought or have clients inform us that things need to look the same in every browser. The answer to that is no, they can't. This is Dan Cederholm's answer at do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser.com. The question is not do they need to look the same in every browser, but can they look the same in every browser? And the answer to that is no. And unless you accept that, you're always going to be either limiting your potential or chasing this false dream that one day, on that sunny morning, the CSS3 specification is going to be delivered by Charlton Heston and all browsers will magically support it. If you're thinking of that, or you're working for people that are waiting for that, then you're living in a fantasy world. We need to accept the dynamic realities of what we're doing and working with every single day and move on and make cool things. So let's talk about one or two of the reasons why websites can't look the same in every browser. The first thing that we need to learn is that the W3C itself is not an innovation body. Now, I had a very short and uncomfortable experience being on the CSS working group a few years ago. I went into that very, very naively, expecting that the CSS working group would be made up of like-minded individuals that, would sit eating muffins and drinking Horlicks and would make CSS one day. And that at some point, after the W3C's CSS working group designing CSS, they would make a specification, it would be finished, and that after that the browser makers could choose to implement it or not. Is that how you think the process works? They design a system, they design a specification, and then the browser makers adopt it. Because that's a commonly held view, and it's certainly the view that I had when I started getting involved with the CSS working group. The thing that I didn't realize at the time was that the working group is made up of pay-to-play participants. These are large multinational, multi-billion-dollar organizations, for the most part, that pay to be on the CSS working group. They pay their membership to the W3C, and they do that because they want to achieve their own business objectives. And if we think about some of the stuff that's been languishing, rotting, fermenting in the CSS working group for such a long time, think about things like grid positioning or advanced layout or any of these kind of template systems that have no backing, no enthusiasm from browser makers. And then you see how rapidly things like CSS transitions and multiple backgrounds and, to a certain extent, things like keyframe animations are now becoming more rapidly adopted. And that's because they're being pushed by those browser makers to satisfy their own agenda. Apple, for example, is going to be pushing animation into CSS because of the whole flash on mobile devices argument. Microsoft needs to be a little more cautious because of their own more kind of corporate clients. You know, whether or not these companies say they make any money or not, or whether that's their agenda or not, we all know that that's the case. You know, we all know that they have competitive advantage that they want to gain. They at least don't want to be seen as falling behind. And I was very naive when I went into this process. And this is a lovely quote. Here we go. I won't read the whole thing for you, but, yeah, well, in fact, I will. A collaborative, non-partisan discussion, that's his emphasis, not mine. What do you think is a standardization body? It's a battlefield where vendors fight for competitive advantage. Who said that? The co-chair of the CSS working group, a guy called Dan Glasman. He also said, Andy, you're incredibly naive or incredibly out of your mind. Which, yeah, not for the first time, obviously. You know, we need to be thinking beyond the politics. We need to be thinking beyond what browser makers are doing. We need to be thinking beyond the limitations, the conventions that we've grown up with, except that browsers are not going to see the same CSS at the same time, that web designers are not going to have this magical day one day when all browsers will see the same CSS. It's just not going to work. It's not going to work because CSS3 isn't a standard. It's broken down intentionally into a series of modules that browser makers can work on, implement, or choose not to implement, at their own pace, to meet their own agendas, and that those modules will continually evolve. Last week, I read for the first time the CSS4 backgrounds and borders module, which you can see online. CSS4. So these things are being continually iterated. If you're waiting for this magical day, forget it. What you need to do, accept the realities of how these standards are made, accept the realities of what browser makers are doing, keep calm, and carry on. In fact, more than that, get hard-boiled. And because if we take a different attitude, if we take a different approach to what we're designing for the web, what we can do is to get really excited about stuff and to make exciting things. Now, this does need a slightly different approach to perhaps the way that we've thought about doing things in the past, thought about the ways in which we've interpreted that term progressive enhancement. Because what most people will do is they'll start off with this lowest common denominator design. And they'll start off with something which is basically functioning in lowest common denominator browsers, which to a lot of people still is Ie6. Well, if you start off from the lowest common denominator, there's only so far up that you can reach. No wonder we're only adding rounded corners and drop shadows to things, because there's only so far that you can stretch up. Well, forget that approach. Let's do something hard-boiled. Let's do something completely different. And instead of starting at the bottom and working up, let's start off at the top, design for the capabilities of the best browsers out there, and then work downwards, intelligently deciding what happens when a browser doesn't support a particular CSS property. That, I feel, is the way in which we're going to start creating amazing work. Now, I know when I've talked about some of this stuff before, some people have gone, yeah, but come on, Clarky, you're just making up this hard-boiled term, you know, to sell a few books. Yeah, isn't that just graceful degradation? Well, my answer to that is, to hell with being graceful. You know, what we need to do is we need to start freeing ourselves from these limitations and doing cool and exciting things. And people are out there doing it at the moment. This is, whether it's on personal projects, this is from John Hicks, or with companies that rely on their websites generating their revenue, there are people out there that are being brave enough to do it. So what I've been doing over the last few months is to come up with some hardboard examples. Now, these are going to set Collie's arms, the hairs on your arms standing up, because this is like every piece of gratuitous animation and CSS. Every single property that I can throw in has gone in. There's no restraint in these, mate. There's been no reduction.
I knew these were coming out. You're still here.
So, just to demonstrate some of the things that we can potentially do. This is not a recipe book, but I want to start off by talking about this Hardboiled 404 page, which I designed. And this, as the designer, this is how I want this thing to look. This is my ultimate look for this particular page. And you can see there that I've got that lovely kind of pillow embossed impression in the blood stain. So to make that happen, the markup is incredibly simple. It's just a division with some elements inside it. And then we can use CSS font face to specify that we're going to use particular typefaces. This is chunk 5 that comes off Font Scroll. Really good resource. And from there, we can simply specify all of the different typefaces in the stack, working down, because, you know, we've been doing this hard-boiled approach in a certain way for years, just in the way that we work with font stacks, where we're starting off with the best font that we want to use, and then working downwards. Come on, be honest, when was the last time you actually tested a website using sans serif? You don't. You always start at the very best and then work down. And that's exactly the approach that I'm talking about taking. So, skip through some of this code stuff. What I'll also do at this point is to add a little bit of text shadow and to make that lovely kind of pillow embossed effect that we so adore from Photoshop filters. We'll add in some text fill. This is text fill transparent. So it's actually going to remove the background color, remove the color property itself, just leave the outline. We can stroke around the edges of that text, and this is what we get. So if you zoom in, you can see all of the combinations of those particular properties. And this is how it looks in a WebKit-based browser. But if we go down from there, if we then open this, for example, this is in Opera 10.5, which is an amazingly good browser. This is my second browser on the Mac now, because Firefox just looks so shit, for the most part. And then we go down from there. Sorry, this is, yeah, that's Opera. And then we go down from there into a Windows browser. We can see that the design is still being held together. It's still an appropriate and acceptable design for people who use the level of capabilities of that particular browser or software. Now, for a lot of times, we always moan about Internet Explorer. It seems to be like the favorite thing to moan about. What's holding us back in terms of doing cool stuff on the web? This is using the latest beta of Camino for the Mac. Doesn't support font face. So whenever Camino actually comes out of beta and Mac users rush to install it, this is what they're going to see. So it's no longer about the age of browsers or legacy browsers or the difference between old browsers and modern browsers. It's about the capability of a browser and what that browser can do and how much of our design it can support. That's the approach we should take. This is another page from this particular site where I've actually done some business cards. I had a competition on the website and loads of people kind of submitted these crazy ideas. You won't really get an idea until I switch into video and you can see what this is doing. Now the markup for this is really, really simple. I'm a real microformats nut. So this is just a series of V-cards. Nothing more than that. And with every single V-card, what I've done is to set some basic styling on those elements. I'm absolutely positioning them. I'm giving them some dimensions. But I want to position each one of those cards into this grid. So for that, I'm going to use the nth of type selector to apply a different background image from that card into each area on the grid. So people often ask, why don't you use nth child in this particular situation? What's wrong with using nth child? You'll notice that I didn't add any specific IDs or classes onto those elements because I want them to be completely flexible and dynamic in terms of the input. Well, in this particular case, those cards are not the first element inside that container. So we can't really use nth child reliably. There's a heading in the middle there. So nth of type is a really good and appropriate selector to use, because that doesn't, it selects elements wherever they happen to be inside the document flow. And then what we're going to do is it's looking okay, but it's looking a little kind of rigid. So let's use some CSS transforms just to break up that grid. So we can rotate and translate an element in the X or in the Y variety. X meaning horizontally, Y meaning vertically. Or we can do both. We can scale an element. In this particular case, using both scaling properties, scaling it down by 50%. Or we can scale both horizontally and vertically. Or we can skew an element, we can distort an element. Again, horizontally or vertically, or a combination of the two. And we can transform those elements around different origin points. So this is using the transform origin property. 0, 0 is exactly the same as left top, and we can then rotate those elements around the different origins to get just that precise degree of control that we want to accomplish that design. And what I'll then do is to apply some of those rotations to odd numbers of cards and then override them with some nth of type expressions just to move those cards around so that they fit very nicely into that grid, including that center one where I've changed the orientation round to portrait. And that's what we end up with. So this is what it looks like inside a WebKit browser. Let's add some of these transitions, which, again, can be very easily overused. Subtlety isn't usually my thing. So how can we apply some of those transitions just to add this element of surprise, if you like, to the user? So here we're going to use the CSS Transition property. We're going to say everything that changes is going to transition. It's going to take 0.4 of a second, and it's going to have smooth acceleration and deceleration. And then on hover, I'm going to rotate those elements back into the original position and scale them up a little bit just to make that clickable area much more obvious to the user. And we can do a whole bunch of different transition properties. You know, we could even change the font face on hover, or do all of these properties. There's so much more than we're currently using. So what about this approach of designing for the best and designing for the top down rather than for the bottom up? Well, why do all e-commerce sites have to look like Amazon? Why do they all have to have this conventional look and feel? So I wanted to design something for this particular store which just breaks the mold a little bit and can show off some of these new properties. Now again, you won't really see the full effect of this until I go into video. There's no Flash and there's no JavaScript on these pages whatsoever. Everything is all done just purely through CSS, including the firing events. So how did that get built? Well, we start off, again, with very, very simple, basic HTML markup. In this particular case, I needed to add a unique ID onto each one of those elements. And inside there, we just have two things. We have the front cover image and a division for the description. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply some basic styling to those containers themselves. We're going to float each one of those items to the left, give it some dimensions and a little bit of margin. And then inside that division, we can then absolutely position both the image and the division with the description, one on top of the other, so that they sit exactly in the same horizontal and vertical space inside that container. And if you want to push the boat out, we can add a little bit of border radius or some box shadow, just because we don't know when to stop. Well, I don't know when to stop. And this is what we end up with. Now, to get that 3D effect, we can use the perspective property, which is currently WebKit only, and then define an animation and apply that animation to the particular element. So here we're saying that we're going to create an animation effect, and it's going to be called book flip. It's going to take an element and transform it, starting off at 0, rotating at 180 degrees, and then back to 0. And we can then apply that to the container. We can say that it's going to take 2 seconds to do that. It's only going to happen the once, and again, it's going to have that smooth acceleration and deceleration. And this is what we get. Very simple. The HTML is completely meaningful. There's really not any presentational cruft in there. And we can do this with CSS now for those browsers that can support it, and there are lots, if we consider Safari, Chrome, etc. So we design for the very top. We design for what the most capable browsers can see, and then design alternative experiences, appropriate experiences for browsers that don't support the properties that we need to use to accomplish our best design. And sometimes those changes can be incredibly subtle. The code that we need can be just a few lines. So with this particular design, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take those two elements, the image and the description, and I'm going to override the positioning values, and I'm going to float them to the left so that they sit on side each other. And that is what a user in Firefox will see. Is that inappropriate? No, it's completely appropriate to the capabilities of that particular piece of software. And that's how it's going to look in Opera and even in Internet Explorer. So we're designing for the capabilities of browsers. Now, I know what people say in terms of browser testing and Q&A departments and everything else. Yeah, but, you know, the client won't accept that, and, you know, it doesn't look the same across all browsers. You know, let me let you into a little secret. It's only web geeks that even know that there's more than one browser. You know, your mother doesn't go find a website that she likes and then open it up in Firefox to check it looks the same. It doesn't happen. And we need to convey that to the clients and the people that we work with and take on this different approach. And sometimes those experiences can be tweaked, they can be slightly different, or they could be very different. This is the same HTML without any changes whatsoever, just by changing the CSS. Again, there's no JavaScript included here. We can create a completely different and possibly more appropriate experience for people that are using different browsers or different devices. You know, you might argue that that is a more appropriate experience for an iPad in landscape mode. So when you turn the browser into landscape orientation, it may change the experience completely. Who knows? We could use exactly the same HTML to produce these little JavaScript-less bubbles that appear. It's exactly the same thing. It's an image and then a description. We've not changed the HTML. It's just done in a different way. And this is even supported in Internet Explorer, you know, way back. Or we could do something completely crazy where we turn those things into a series of book covers on a stack. Again, there isn't any change in the HTML there, just CSS. So it's deciding what is appropriate, what is the appropriate experience that somebody's going to have when they encounter our design on the browser or the device that it is that they're using. Now, all of this calls into question, what the hell does browser testing mean anymore? Because I don't know about you, but it used to be that people would sit there with a ruler, measuring things up, making sure that everything was in alignment, yeah? It used to be that you get phone calls from the client at 9 o'clock at night to say, oh my God, I've just opened it up in X browser and it doesn't look the same. Please go fix it. Luckily, I hope, if we take a different approach, we're going to be way beyond those kind of arguments. Because what I actually think it means today is it means pretty mean browser testing. It means really deciding on what it is that we are going to spend our time and our clients' money on doing. How far down the chain do we need to go? How far do we need to change the design to make it the most appropriate that it can be for the browsers and the devices that people are actually using in the real world? And, you know, that's a pretty hardboiled approach. Now, is PPK in the room?
Yeah.
Excellent. We can have a fight.
Yeah, I'm not saying so.
A lot of these new properties, a lot of the approach that I think we should take involves using vendor prefixes. And I know that when we've been doing a lot of the stuff that I've shown you, a lot of people get very irritated and annoyed in the fact that you have to write the same declaration like 4 times or something. But these browser vendor prefixes are incredibly important. They're incredibly important to us because they enable us to only supply a particular property to the browsers that we want to send those to at this point. But they also allow browser makers to really perfect and develop and experiment with these properties before they go mainstream. So, for example, if Microsoft, just to give you an example, which I've been arguing with Microsoft about, if they go for border radius in IE9 without implementing the vendor prefix, the -ms prefix, and they break it. Let's argue, for example, that their implementation of border radius is very jaggy and has the background that bleeds out behind the rounded corners. If they did that, and if they implemented border radius without a prefix and they break it, they get it wrong, they've just screwed border radius for every other browser maker that has also got a stable implementation like Opera of border radius. So these things are incredibly important. So if you're worried about having to write the same declaration like 4 times with a different prefix, welcome to the real world. We don't have to write box model hacks anymore. You know, this is part of the game. Now, what some people have done when they get all excited about these particular new properties in CSS, what they do is they dig out that copy of the dynamic HTML Bible that they had from like 1998 that's probably propping up your monitor or something. And they go, bloody hell, we can do opacity and gradients and rotation and all this stuff because in Microsoft Internet Explorer, because they've got these filters that will enable us to do it. In fact, there was an article, Yali, I think it was today on Smashing Magazine, which is all about Microsoft proprietary filters from like 1997. There's a problem. Not just a performance problem with these proprietary filters, but also a philosophical problem. Because people say, well, you know, what's the difference between a Microsoft filter and a -WebKit extension? Well, for the most part, the vendor prefixes are part of a standardization process. The properties that I'm talking about are part of the emerging CSS3 modules. Microsoft filters never were and never will be. They're proprietary and closed, and they will never be part of that standardized process. So apart from the performance hit, there's this philosophical argument which says if we bend over backwards to pile all this old crap into our style sheets, what incentive is there for Microsoft to actually do the job properly? And we have an enormous power as web designers and developers because we can really influence what the browser makers do next. But most importantly, it's appropriate to the capabilities of the software and the device. This is from the Hardboiled search results page, which uses multiple background images and a little bit of CSS rotation. In IE7 or 8, this is what it's going to look like. It's a completely appropriate experience for that particular browser. Now, how far you take it is entirely up to you. About 2 years ago, I started feeding on all of my client projects what I called my universal Ie6 Css Stylesheet, which is just purely based on typography. And I host this up on Google Code and link to it for every single client project, and I've encouraged people to do the same. So this is what that page would look like in Internet Explorer 6. At some point, as Tim was saying, you know, we do have to take a very pragmatic approach and say, do we want to be limited by the lowest common denominator, or do we want to move our work and the web forward? And I've been serving this particular style sheet now for a couple of years, and nobody's complained. Not a single client has come back and said, I've just looked at this site in Ie6, and this is what it looks like. It's terrible. They've not had any client or any of their customers come back and complain, because for the most part, ignorance is bliss. People expect what they see. They will only, they won't know that something is missing based on the browser that they're actually using. And you know, that is a particularly hard-boiled approach. But I think in general it's very, very important that what we do is to try to move our work forward and not be limited by old-fashioned thinking and old-fashioned notions, and really strive to do the best possible work that we can with the most advanced tools that we can possibly get our hands on, because I think that's what makes the web an exciting place for us to work in. So with that, I'm done. I think I'm out of time and out of budget, and Dan needs resuscitating. A lot of this stuff is going into a book later on in the year, and there'll be an iPad app alongside that with it as well. So if you want to keep up with my insane ramblings, then you can follow things on Twitter, and thank you very much.
How do you present your designs to the client?
I made a decision about a year or 2 years ago that I would stop showing clients Photoshop comps for a variety of different reasons. I actually prefer to use fireworks rather than Photoshop. But it dawned on me after a particularly nasty project that I was working on with a developer in the States that I was wasting an enormous amount of time in the process. Spending a huge amount of time on designing not necessarily the look and feel, which is, of course, is something that you might do in a graphics editor, but, you know, moving little form field elements around. And, you know, I would be up till 3 in the morning because they would send a document over that wanted me to change the words on text fields or text labels. But what is the point of that? They're not paying me to be a typist. You know, I don't do shorthand. So I realized that not only was it an incredible waste of time for designers to do that, and, you know, lots of my clients have budgets, but also it wasn't actually designing for the medium. People can't, how can you get over the effect of a liquid layout in a Photoshop comp? You can't. I mean, is that one of the reasons why so many web page layouts are fixed and centered? Because that's what the client signed off on a Photoshop document. So and you know, how do you get over what happens when somebody text sizes up or down? Even simple things. How the hell do you comp something like those CSS3 things up?
Yeah.
You can't. So really building on what Dan was talking about, I would take it a stage further and say, sure, design look and feel in Photoshop, but never show a client that Photoshop comp. Yeah, work on it yourself if you want to. You know, I still work in Photoshop to get that kind of look and feel stuff done. But after that, spend an hour or 2, which is all it takes to mock something up in HTML and CSS and show them that. And the cool thing about that is that I've found within single organization, one part of the client team used Safari on his Mac, and the other person used IE8 on her Vista laptop or something. They both saw exactly the same comps. They both really liked the designs. They both, you know, let me go ahead and do it, and nobody knew the difference between the two. Because ignorance is bliss. They were seeing something which was completely appropriate. If I'd have designed that in Photoshop, shown them that as a document with rounded corners and drop shadows and all the stuff, I've just created a world of pain for myself. Because they will expect to see that in every browser that they've ever heard of, regardless of whether or not people still use it or it's actually appropriate. So never show clients static design visuals. Always show them something in the browser, and that's been my philosophy.
Question from the audience. Do we want to be limited by the lowest common denominator, i.e. Ie6? Question mark.
Hell no. Now, and to be honest, if I was designing a site for myself and I looked at the browser statistics, if I wanted to sell a product online and, you know, my target audience said, my target audience used, you know, 98% Ie6, then if I was to do some of the things that I've been talking about in this talk, I'd be completely mad. Because, you know, you've got to design appropriately for your audience. Yeah. So, in certain respects, you've got to look at the stats, but you should really be creating rules almost rather than following them, I think, a lot of the time.
Rather than sticking by the old.
Yeah, but, you know, at some point, people have to realise, clients have to realise what it is that's involved for us in working with an older browser like that. And I think that what is a good approach for people to take, and I did this with a redesign on New Internationalist last year, where I said, right, we've got 3 days left in the budget, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to spend those 3 days working on Ie6? Do you want me to spend 1 day working on Ie6 for just the store pages, and then we can use the other time to spend, like, you know, designing cool stuff? Yeah. Or should I just forget about IE, serve them the universal style sheet, and we'll spend those 3 days really doing something that's going to make a difference to the usability or the bottom line or anything else? And they said, we'll go for the middle one, which they always do. So we spent a day just making sure that those layouts on the store pages worked okay, because that's what brings the company money. But in terms of all the content, no, it's all using universal. So give people the choice. Don't stay up at night thinking, I've got to do this, or I've got to work with IE6 stuff. Actually give people the choice and be honest about it and say, it's your time, it's my time and your money, what am I spending it on? Never ever just let the client say, but I thought you were a professional. Doesn't a professional web designer know how to make cross-browser websites? No, punch them in the nose.
Brilliant. We had a little chat a while ago on the phone, and we started chatting about HTML5.
You weren't supposed to mention our late night chats, mate.
Damn it, dropped myself in again.
The wife's in the audience.
Are you using HTML5 as a norm now, or is it something that you're just dabbling with and going to use more later, or?
I think it's not a question of either or. One of the nice things about HTML5 is that it doesn't invent a new standard. It standardizes what people ordinarily do. Okay. So you could take any website that anybody in this room has ever made and change the doc type and it'll be HTML5. Now, whether or not you want to then go down the road of using the new structural elements, well, that's something else. There are particular problems with IE. You're not able to style those elements without a JavaScript shiv or modernizer to actually create those elements in the DOM. So you might want to say, well, I'm not going to use those structural elements. I'm still going to do div class equals section or div class equals article and move on that way. But there's no reason why we all shouldn't be doing HTML5 stuff now, because it is going to be the future of what we're doing. Yeah. How far you take it is up to you. Preference. But my personal preference is that every single job I'm doing now is full HTML5 stuff. It's written into the contract that I get my clients to sign that we will write HTML5 and do CSS 2.1 plus 3, and nobody ever questions it. So I don't even bring it up. I don't even bring it up in conversation. Just bring it up. Just put it in the contract.
Brilliant. Well, that's fantastic, Andy. So,
been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yes.